We have been told that media has to deliver on two areas. One is to bear witness, another one is to make sense. If you're looking at the Western media on Gaza, we are neither, there's a bearing witness component, nor making sense. The best example happens with the International Court of Justice case, which has been going on. And if you're looking at the Western media, we get so little out of it. There's neither reporting on it nor giving an analysis of this. At the same time, I also wonder about one aspect of the ethical courage displayed by individual journalists. While media houses may have failed, individual journalists have taken stand. And one of the most interesting thing was the resignation letter from the poetry editor of New York Times. I would like to read out a small portion from her resignation letter. She's a Pulitzer Prize winning poet, and she's a poetry editor of the New York Times, Annie Boyer. In her resignation letter, she says, I cannot write about poetry amidst reasonable tones of those who aim to acclimatize us to this unreasonable suffering. No more ghoulish euphemisms, no more verbally sanitized hellscapes, no more mongering lies. If this resignation letter is an indicator, I think that the individual courage of journalists is much more important than the institutional failure of the profession. And I think that these individual journalists are keeping our faith in public sphere as well as on idea of what is truth. With this brief introduction, I would like to ask Mr. Ram, because he had seen the crisis media had faced even during Vietnam War. From there till now, we find that the dominant narrative seems to gain currency, but other views also find to have some sort of resonance. In the present context, how do we bring out space for reasonable narratives?
Thank you. The title of this session is Israel's War on Gaza and the Palestine Problem, Role of Media in Building the Narrative. And I just wanted to point out that we got a very clear impression from the previous session from Professor Pape, his impression of how Western media and the languages he reads or understands, what his impression was. That was very clear. And I think I would like to follow up from there, because he spoke about progressive accept on Israel and so on. And in some ways he spoke about the hollowness of liberal democracy in the West. Liberal democracy, democratic theory, asserts for the most part that in countries like the United States and the UK, the media are free, they are independent, they are respectful of diversity and pluralism of views, they strive to report the news fairly, fully, and without undue biases, that they play adversarial roles, and indeed, that they act as watchdogs of the democratic and public interest. That's the claim. But we have learned from the writings of Chomsky, Noam Chomsky, and Edward Herman in a well-known book called Manufacturing Consent that there is also a propaganda model at work. And they have applied this to the US and particularly US foreign policy in its neighborhood. And they have exposed the claims of liberal democratic theorizing when it comes to the media. Not that it is all useless. There are some excellent investigative reporting. There are voices that go against the current, and so on. Nevertheless, speaking about the mainstream media, the word that Professor Pape used, this, I think, holds true. And in fact, this line of thinking about the media goes back much earlier than Chomsky and so on. Because Walter Lippmann, one of the most influential journalists of the 20th century, was deeply concerned over the vulnerability, at that time the press mainly, the press to official propaganda. And he addressed the challenge with insight in his important works, in two important works of the 1920s, a time when journalism, alongside Western democracy, was seen to be or perceived to be in crisis, in deep crisis. One of those works, they're still available online, Liberty and the News, published in 1920. And the second one was an essay co-authored with Charles Murs titled A Test of the News. And basically they pointed out this was a sort of content analysis of mainly the coverage of the New York Times, a test of the news, on the Russian Revolution, which greatly interested Lippmann. He was by no means a leftist. His views were very, very much to the right, although he called himself initially liberal. But just read that and you'll see how often they were wrong, just plain wrong. And I think this is available. You can look up A Test of the News and the conclusions of that, where they were repeatedly wrong. In fact, that study was devoted to 7 periods of time where the coverage contradicted evidence from undisputed sources on main events relating to that subject. I don't have to go further except to cite the conclusion that the New York Times' reporting was neither unbiased nor accurate. The newspapers' news stories were not based on facts, I'm quoting from this, but were determined by the hopes of the men who made up the news organizations. And the newspaper referred to events that had not taken place, atrocities that did not exist, and reported no fewer than 91 times that the Bolshevik regime was on the verge of collapse. The Soviet Union collapsed very much later after that, as everybody knows. So this kind of analysis of the propaganda model of coverage in presenting narratives, I think, is well established in the literature. We don't know enough about media coverage of what's going on in Gaza, but we can certainly form impressions, and there is a certain amount of evidence. So far as coverage in India is concerned, I'll come to that a little later, there is very little evidence. And it is certainly a subject where the research wing of this institution can undertake a content analysis over a particular time period and see how, whether the English language press or television or the media in another major Indian language, Hindi or Tamil or Malayalam and so on, whichever you like. This is a research project which is doable in a fairly short time. And you can see how, if any significant coverage took place of what's happening in Gaza, whether there's any on-the-spot reporting, whether they're simply swallowing Western narratives, or maybe they were using more from Al Jazeera and so on. We just don't know enough. But there are a couple of articles. For News Laundry, for example, published an article From Gaza to Kashmir. Why is Indian media suffering from selective coverage syndrome? Basically, it says that nothing worthwhile has appeared, but it cites the one exception it says is a Frontline magazine cover story. I'm not advertising it here, I'm just referring to it because it's worth mentioning, because there's a whole issue devoted to genocide in Gaza. It came out the September 17th issue. Please read it. And in fact, the editor, Vaishnav Roy, was immediately trolled, viciously trolled by the large brigade called the Bucks. We call them, and they just go to the social media sites and see how she was trolled on Facebook, on Twitter, and so on. I also intervened on that, basically pointing out that the coverage was perfectly legitimate. In fact, apart from a representative of Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, it also had two Israeli, one security analyst and another representative, and so on. But this issue incensed the Israeli ambassador in India so much that he directly intervened in what should have been an internal media matter. But anyway, that's one. But other than that, basically it says that the coverage is largely borrowed from Western news agencies as what are published in the Western press. I cannot but mention a recent India Today item that boasts Israel uses India Today report in international court during Gaza death hearing. Just read that. And this is not an on-the-spot report or anything like that. It had something, but Israel obviously used it in its response to the South African charge sheet, if you like, on this. So, other than this, of course, there have been editorials on the question of whether Indian media organizations should have sent reporters into Gaza. I'm not so clear. This has been criticized in these articles, in News Laundry and also, I think, in another article in The Wire. Because who are these people who are going to Gaza? A very large number of journalists has been killed. I think the figure is well over 100. But the overwhelming majority being Arab journalists and not Western journalists, not journalists from, I think 2 journalists from Israel definitely. But those who have gone in and have reported from Western media organizations are those who are embedded in the Israeli defense forces, and what they send out is censored, and this is being shamefully used without vetting by their media organizations, including the New York Times, including the Washington Post, and including the Los Angeles Times. And I think there's a very detailed analysis, a content analysis by The Intercept called Coverage of Gaza War in the New York Times and other major newspapers, how they heavily favored Israel. And there's a lot of evidence to back it up. I just want to give you a few examples. You should read it yourselves, those interested in this particular, in the subject being discussed in this session. That, and I'm quoting here from this analysis, major US newspapers, they are referring particularly to these 3, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times. They disproportionately emphasized Israeli deaths in the conflict, used emotive language to describe the killings of Israelis, but not Palestinians, and offered lopsided coverage of anti-Semitic acts in the US, while largely ignoring anti-Muslim racism, or what is called Islamophobia, in the wake of October 7. And this is an open source analysis for done during the first 6 weeks of the conflict. And they cite the use of phrases when it came to Hamas's outrageous attacks on civilians. It's called slaughter or massacre, but these words never find usage when it comes to the killings of civilians in Gaza and so on. This is, and there are many other aspects of a complete propaganda model at work in this. The word slaughter, for example, the term slaughter was used by editors and reporters to describe the killing of Israelis versus Palestinians, and it's 60-1. 60-1. Massacre was used to describe the killing of Israelis versus Palestinians, 125-2. Horrific was used to describe the killing of Israelis versus Palestinians, 36-4, and so on. So you get the point that we are not surprised by this. There are precedents before this, for what happened, but right now it is playing before our eyes. And but relating to what Professor Pape said, in the United States itself, it has been reported a large section of younger people are not buying into this narrative. And that is one reason for the troubles on the campuses, troubles that have already claimed the jobs of 2 university presidents, of Harvard University, and before that, the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, because they couldn't handle what was happening. On the one hand, they said, what was considered anti-Semitic, the way that Professor Pape and others have explained it, you know what it means, criticizing the actions of Israel in a certain way, in a vehement way, is considered anti-Semitic. And if a university president says that comes under free speech, the right of free speech, moreover in the United States, the First Amendment on paper reads like almost absolutist approach to free speech. So if given these two things, I think you can easily explain why the presidents of these two places, who are quite respected. Oh, he's giving me the clock. But I have plenty of time left, it turns out. What's happened. So I think it is clear what kind of narrative is being built. In fact, I'm not going to even take the 10 minutes that are left. Returning to what I said earlier on my question, and this is what some students of the ACJ may wish to consider, try to get some answers from ChatGPT 4 specifically, to which I subscribe. It's $20 a month. That's about 1,700 rupees a month. And even if you're not going to take it forever, if you want to study this conflict, I think it is quite affordable. So you try, playing with these, what are called prompts. If you ask the question, what's going on in Gaza? Is it genocide? Ask it in English. Ask it in another language. You may not know Arabic, but you can certainly ask in some other languages that you're familiar with. And I bet that the answers will be significantly different. We don't know what these large language models are being trained on. They're not transparent about it, but surely a large part of it will come from what's out there in the internet, and quite a lot of it is from the media. You know that the New York Times has sued OpenAI and even Microsoft for training, for apparently violating its rights and so on. That will be interesting. But then ask these questions. And getting the prompts right, I think, is going to be very interesting, very important. The more detailed you ask, for example, what's happening in Gaza, is it genocide, children, women, etc., you're going to get more detailed answers. And indeed, some experiments have already been done by scholars, because these ChatGPT, like all artificial intelligence, has been taught by us and is to a considerable extent being fed by the news media, and therefore these narratives. So one of them, an academic called Mona Chalabi, British author and journalist, posed 2 questions about the Israel-Palestine conflict to ChatGPT. And the answers provided indicated a clear bias, and she shared them online to show AI's difference in tone and position when asked an objective question about Israelis and Palestinians. I'm quoting from that. Why is Israel attacking civilians in Gaza? That's the prompt. Answer: the situation between Israel and Gaza, particularly during times of conflict, is highly complex and fraught with controversy. When conflicts erupt, civilians on both sides can tragically be caught in the crossfire. Israel has in the past conducted military operations in the Gaza Strip, and these operations have at times resulted in civilian casualties. She's underlined this, these civilian casualties are often unintended. Then there's a table comparing what the answer is if your prompt is about war crimes targeting Palestinian civilians, and then compared with is it a war crime to target civilians, etc. So the answer to is it a war crime that Israel targets Palestinian civilians, infrastructures and hospitals, killing women, children, paramedics and journalists, and cutting off food, water and fuel supplies at Gaza? And the answer to that prompt is the question of whether specific action by any party in an armed conflict, including Israel's military operations in Gaza, constitute war crimes is a matter that should be determined through a thorough, impartial and independent investigation. Accusations of war crimes are serious and complex legal matters. Is it a war? And the other question is it a war crime to target civilians, infrastructures and hospitals, kill women and children, paramedics and journalists, and cut off food, water and fuel supplies of a population during conflict with reference to Palestinians, targeting civilian infrastructure, hospitals and other protected entities is considered a violation of international humanitarian law. These actions can potentially constitute war crimes. So you get the idea that there is not just a double standard, but a complete control or attempt to control the narrative. Unfortunately for those who construct this narrative, as Professor Pape pointed out, apart from the alternative media, on the social media, there are often other accounts which completely rebut what is happening, which disturb people. And I think this is clearly one reason why in the United States, among the younger age groups, particularly people in universities, I think a different perception of what is taking place in Gaza has already posed huge problems to those campuses and to the establishments concerned. Usually we criticize the social media for misinformation and disinformation. It's true, there's a lot of it, even in India. But apart from what the bucks do to people like Vaishnav Roy and others, there are also, you can't shut off what comes, say, on Twitter from elsewhere, from Europe, from the United States, from Al Jazeera and so on. So they are exposed to a greater diversity of sources of information than what you get from the Indian mainstream media. And that's one of the advantages. Actually, the social media on the whole are proving, I think, to be quite a democratizing influence, a progressive influence, something that takes the truth or some of the truth of what is happening to quite a large section of our people. So this is one of the rare moments where we can champion the social media, many of these, and the messages that bring out. Of course, we don't know enough about what's happening, but these are impressions that I think may be worth thinking about and talking about. Thank you.
Sashi to share his opinion.
I'll pick my threads up from where I left off in the introductory remarks. As Ram also indicated, there are two narratives here in terms of the media. One is the street narrative, to put it, and the other is the state narrative, or the official narrative of states concerned. And the street narrative comprises the alternative media as well as social media platforms, which give us a robust idea of what's happening there. Whereas the mainstream media almost homogeneously parrots the official stance of the governments concerned, whether it's the USA, Israel, and so on, which raises the question, why is this so? Of course, there's a propaganda model. And we know there was a time when we spoke about the flow of information from the first world to the third world and the need to correct that. And there was a report, McBride Commission report, which the US vehemently opposed, in fact, quit UNESCO on the grounds of the report being considered and so on. And we thought that was behind us. But we have, again before us, I think this Gaza conflict has precipitated or made us very acutely conscious of the huge disparity and the structural imbalance and the vitiated structure of the dominant media. I was reading recently about a report which is by the Swiss Policy Research Group. This is a research done in 2016 and revalidated in 2019, where the findings are quite obvious, perhaps, but telling, because it comes as a result of objective research group. And of course, they talk about how the three global news agencies in the world, which are, as you know, Associated Press, which is US-based, the AFP, which is based in Paris, French-based, and Reuters, which is based in England, in London. These three agencies, in tandem with what we call the international global media, account for 80+% of the original news that is pervade, global news, shall we say, on incidents like this, which it's a structure of percolation. It's a top-down structure, which then percolates to the national media, national news agencies, like we have the PTI, the Gulf News Agency, MENA in Middle East News Agency, or Concerned News Agency in Europe and other places, Australia and so on, and then to the local indigenous language agencies in our context, for instance, and the equivalents across the world. So it's the reasons being simply that many of the national agencies or even newspapers, even earlier they would not, the foreign correspondents were few, so there are exceptions to that. Now they've cut down on all that. So what really happens is that what these agencies, these global agencies purvey, their worldview is the worldview that actually gets percolated into the whole ecosphere, into the whole media ecosphere. And indicatively, say, Associated Press, as a research paper points out, has about 4,000 employees, journalists. When I say employees, journalists spread across the world. The AFP also has a similar strength of about 4,000 journalists across the world. Reuters has slightly less, about 3,000. Reuters, of course, was taken over somewhere in the middle of 2000s by Thomson, so it's Reuters Thomson, a billionaire Thomson. While AP is owned by the news media in the United States, AFP is a quasi-government structure, and the Reuters is a private. It's owned privately in that sense. And what is pointed out is that these are then, they have as their abutments, if you like, the big global news media, by which we mean the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, perhaps even the BBC, and they may have their own correspondents in some cases, particularly the BBC. And Then the national agencies, as I said, like the PTI, the German DPA, the Austrian APA, Swiss SAA, and so on, partly through their own efforts, but largely taking this as the cue, work the narrative. So this is how the narrative is built. And the narrative is very clearly a narrative which cannot violate what the Swiss research paper calls the Pentagon, the Washington NATO axis when it comes to world news. And that axis actually determines what is to be the news. It's not fortuitous that, it's not coincidental that the idea of embedded journalism originates with the American invasion of Iraq. Embedded journalism was required. Of course, it was posed as a safety measure for journalists in order to protect their lives into some wild territory that you were wading into, which was savage territory, comprising, again there was a racial overtone in depicting the territory that you were going into. I'm not underestimating the dangers. And yet, the idea was that you needed to be embedded with the US forces. And we know thereafter from stray accounts of those who were not embedded with the US forces, the kind of troubles they had, the problems that they had to face when they tried to cover the war or the aftermath of the war in Iraq, even the aftermath of the war in the Iraq. There are some accounts which are quite fascinating. And this, again, we are told now in the context of the IDF, at some point we heard about the idea of being embedded with the IDF if you wanted to know what's happening in the war on Gaza. But things haven't come to that yet because I think things have not gone according to the Israeli plan entirely. And so they haven't got to, I think right now the mood is not to encourage any reportage on the war because it's obviously not going too well, at least as far as Israel is concerned. And so what happens is, therefore, anything that is contrary to this axis will not be tolerated. And we have there's a very, very interesting account, in 2009, and this is again an anecdotal piece of supportive evidence that's cited in this policy report. The head of Associated Press, Tom Curley, he actually exposes the fact, he makes public the fact that the Pentagon employs more than 27,000 PR specialists who, with a budget of nearly $5 billion a year, are kind of working the media on the lines that we indicated and circulating such targeted manipulation or manipulated news. Tom Curley says high-ranking US officials, in fact, threatened that they would ruin an agency or him. This is his own account. If they dared, go against the narrative that in a war situation that they were purveying, and thus the media report, in such situations, dubious stories, and they are. There are also plans of the nature of what you call informants. According to informed sources, defense circles, these are all clear plans. When you read these, he says, they're just substitutes for clear plans because there are also sometimes, covers which create news. They create such a front and say, according to this research institutes, for instance, which have an academic kind of fig leaf, also play into this whole system of creating a narrative. So this is the humongous nature of the problem that we are looking at when we talk about the mainstream effect, what Noam Chomsky has called the mainstream effect, which in combination with a section of the academia makes this gives it a kind of legitimacy and makes this the important, narrative. Which is why you find that in the United States, US, I say US because generally on global events, you take your cue from there, and especially in a war in which the US is at one remove or even closer involved, you tend to get your cues from there. Generally, in such situations, you follow the example of the dominant narrative. So we know what has happened now since even in this short period of 900 days, a very long, tortuous period as far as the people of Gaza are concerned. But in media terms, look at the quick kind of shift. The number of people that have been axed in the US, media people. We heard about the editor of the New York Times, of course. We heard about the MSN, you know, what is that? MSNCB, right? MSNBC, the famous anchor in MSNBC, Mehdi Hassan, in fact, of Indian origin. There have been others. And we have also heard simultaneously about academia, how there is active, movement to make sure that there's no clear free discussion, at least not contrarian discussion that's taking place. And professors, deans, or even presidents of universities find that they have to toe the line. So this is the nature of the problem that we are facing. As Ram mentioned, I think maybe 100, but at least at 79 journalists have already been killed in Gaza. Perhaps more than 100 UN workers have been killed in Gaza. Where do we then get the news? Where do the newspapers, where does the news media get its news? That is the crucial question. And in this kind of organized structure, it's very difficult to understand what is happening, which is why the social media, the street, I think, becomes so crucial at this point in time. What we get from the social media, what we get from the besieged, and shall we say, working against the odds, alternative media, becomes that much more precious. And when you talk about the media, it's not just the news media. Even in the larger ecology of the media, there have been a lot of casualties. Take Hollywood, for instance. A few people have, some of them, Hollywood is supposed to be a liberal bastion, if you like. But you haven't seen the kind of, weighing against this war from Hollywood as you would expect, which is a bit surprising. There have been some exceptions. Susan Sarandon, for instance, not so much she as her, the agency that represents her dropped her. We heard about Melissa Barrera, removed from one of the main title role that she was to play in a series, and she went on Twitter, and I'll quote, at the end of the day, and she stuck to her guns. So she was removed from the title role that she was to play in a series, in an important series. And then she says, at the end of the day, I'd rather be excluded for who I am than be included for who I exclude. So this is the essence of the problem. There is the instance of Michael Eisen, and he's Jewish. He was the editor-in-chief of an open access journal called eLife, and he lost his job for endorsing a satirical article, which is criticizing people dying in Gaza. Which basically he retweeted something from The Onion, which caricatures issues like this, and for that he lost his job. There's the owner, billionaire owner of Art Forum, sacks the chief editor, Jay Penske, again because he expressed solidarity with the Palestinian people in an open letter. And so we have had so many such instances. Now it's a question of difference in degree, not of kind. Perhaps the New York Times is probably better than the Guardian is probably, or rather, Washington Post is probably slightly better than New York Times, is slightly better than the Guardian, or anyway, and this may change a bit, but really not much of a difference. The Guardian, as you know, asked its famous cartoonist, Steve Bell, to leave, who worked with the Guardian for 42 years. And last week I found in the Guardian a very interesting article which they published about how the Indian state and official India is very intolerant of criticism, particularly by cartoonists and stand-up comedians and so on. And for the Guardian to do this a week after, or maybe 2 weeks after it Steve Bell, literally sacked its iconic cartoonist, is the kind of double standard that we are talking about. And then there's the issue of language, as Ram pointed out, and that's a very, very, that's a very, very important issue, because how you characterize the adjectives that you use in the case of some, and where you eliminate that in the case of the other, it's really a racial kind of weightage that you give. It's really a new form of Orientalism, if you like, in terms of language, a language game. And this goes on unquestioned. I mean, this is perhaps not even a conscious factor that we reckon or you factor in when you look at reports or read reports and so on. Yeah, and there's therefore to. I won't take too much longer than this. Perhaps in the question and answer session, we could speak to some of these issues. We really have a crisis of credibility of the media, of the mainstream media, in terms of the reportage broadly in terms of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and that's become very acute now. Acute now because earlier we had no way of knowing the other. Now we have a sense of what is really happening because of social media, because of journalists or citizens in Gaza who are reporting, who are sending us views and news about what's happening there. And therefore we have a sense of what we were ignorant about earlier. So this is how serious it is. And therefore you not only have embedding of journalists to cover the crisis, you have embedding of language of journalists in terms of the way it targets the Palestinians as against the Israelis. You sanitize Israeli acts. You demonize all Palestinian act. It may be the same act, but then you have different yardsticks for characterizing it. And in ever so many ways, therefore, this is really a situation where the benefits of social media are very obvious before us. Not that social media has no problem. We are aware of the issues of misinformation, disinformation, fake news, and so on. But I think in the balance, as Ram also indicated, at this present juncture, we have it's a kind of breath of fresh air. It's where we can really rely on some credible information. Al Jazeera, for instance. Imagine if there was no Al Jazeera. We wouldn't even be able to raise the questions we are thinking of because we have no sense of the other. We have no inkling of the other. We have no inkling about what is really happening, really, except the account, except the narrative. In fact, the represented reality becomes so overwhelming that the real escapes notice. That is the nature. It's almost a kind of, existential kind of problem. So that's how seriously I think we are caught up in this situation. And how do you get out of this? It's certainly the way forward. I mean, the fact that streets have risen up, and it's not just Arabs, it's not just Muslims, it is Jews across cities in Europe, that they have risen up, that they are saying not in our name, that there are mass petitions and letters addressed by young intellectuals, particularly the millennial generation, say from the 18 to 34 age group. There was this wonderful letter which corporate media refused to publish, which N+1 published, where I think hundreds of such young, what they call precariats of the Jewish age group of millennial age group of say 18 to 34, they spoke about how you cannot synonymize or how you cannot conflate, shall we say, anti-Semitism with Zionism, because the ploy that is engaged by Israel has been that the moment you say, you conflate this so that you're as bad as the other. If you say anything about Zionism, then you're anti-Semitic. Obviously, that's not true. And so on. So there are ever so many ways and levels at which this is working. And the media is, unfortunately, largely the mainstream media is, I think, not just marginally, but I think in the thick of this. It's part of the problem. It's become part of the problem as much as, it's not there fighting people or killing people, but by whitewashing it, by giving it the spin it does, by justifying it in the manners that it does, by the facile justifications or excuses or apologia the media put out, it is become part of the problem. So the representative reality is running away with the ball, and people in Gaza continue to die. So these are just some points I thought I'll add to the discourse. We have to be, I think, very conscious, therefore, of the other, not just of the other when we must be conscious of the other, we are talking about being conscious of the minorities. And I'm saying being conscious of the other narrative, of what is the real narrative, what is happening out there. And I think we are historically at a situation where that is a huge challenge for media practitioners, theorists, thinkers, and if media is representing what is happening in the world, then I think we are in danger of being grossly, misrepresented too as consumers of the media. And so many of us, because of this whole structure of the media, who are practicing media, are also unbeknownst to ourselves, carrying forward the kind of lies, half-truths, the spins, the prejudices, the biases that the global media, which is in tandem with the, shall we say, the Pentagon-NATO nexus or the White House-NATO nexus is perpetuating. Thank you.
Thank you, Shashi. Yeah. See, after 2001 attack on Twin Towers, when Western media started producing dossiers on weapons of mass destruction, there were substantial internal critique about these type of dossiers being produced. For instance, when Tony Blair and team planted some of the dossiers, the critique of those dossiers came from mainstream media. But today what is happening is that we are having very little critique from within. And Anjali is one of the journalists who started reporting after the 9/11 Islamophobia which gripped the media. Therefore, what are the changes you are seeing as a journalist, and how do you think the present situation is far more different from what we witnessed immediately after 9/11?
A great question, and it's lovely to be back at ACJ. I'm just going to start with a little story about kind of how I got into journalism, actually. It's the year before I joined ACJ. I was teaching English in a small village in Jordan and beginning to learn Arabic. And it was the evening of September 30th, 2000. And I think this will sort of begin to answer your question as well. And I was sitting with a large group of people on the floor of the home of the mayor of the village. The second Palestinian Intifada had just begun next door. And as the only person in the village with a satellite TV, the mayor, there were dozens of people crammed into his home to watch the news. Everyone was glued at the time to Al Jazeera Arabic, when the anchor cut to a live feed from a French television station in Gaza. A 12-year-old boy is cowering against a wall. His father, crouching over him, is frantically trying to shield his son's body from a rain of bullets. They both look terrified. The boy was shot in his stomach and died in his father's arms. This video of Mohammed ad-Durra's killing was captured by a Palestinian cameraman for France 2 television and was broadcast on channels across the world. The image of this father trying desperately to protect his son became one of the most iconic images of the Second Palestinian Intifada. Back then, I couldn't really understand Arabic, and definitely not the formal kind of Arabic of the news. So the mayor kindly switched back and forth between different channels for me. Jordan 2, Israel 2, BBC, CNN. At first, all of the English language channels simply showed the video with some brief commentary from the anchors. It seemed like a father trying to protect his son from gunfire and failing. It was a tragic loss. Some even played interviews with Palestinian eyewitnesses to the boy's death. But in less than an hour, the messaging had changed. Mohammed Durra's father had ties to the militant groups attacking Israel. He was a terrorist. Maybe the boy was too. We really can't trust this video. Maybe the cameraman was biased. Israel 2, BBC, CNN, every hour, on the hour. Don't trust the images you are seeing. This video that we're playing is not of a terrified father trying to save his son. Something else is going on here. Don't sympathize with the Palestinians. Don't trust the Palestinian narrative. For me, this was a very early lesson about how media bias works, and more importantly, as Mr. Ram mentioned, what Chomsky and Herman famously called the manufacturing of consent and how it works. Today, in Israel's genocidal war in Gaza, the media machine is much sharper. And personally, as someone who's covered post-9/11 wars, both the crackdown in the US and the wars in other parts of the Middle East, it's been shocking to see how outlets like the New York Times, which have done somewhat of a mea culpa in recent years and acknowledged the damages of the war on terror, have just gone back to a much stronger position of siding very openly with the Israelis. And we're seeing this in the US media, the British media, and the German media most clearly, which is not surprising because the US, the UK, and Germany are most closely aligned with what's going on in Israel. And you can see this clearly, as Mr. Ram mentioned and Mr. Sashi Kumar mentioned, very clearly in what gets covered, and also how any attempt, if you watch some of the Western channels, how any attempt, or even radio programs in the US, any attempt to provide context or history is met with angry denunciations. Are you justifying the attack of October 7th? What about Hamas? Why don't you just condemn it instead of explaining it? Take South Africa's historic case of genocide against Israel at the ICJ. Like Mr. Paneerselvam mentioned, not a single Western media outlet live streamed South Africa's submissions to the court on January 11th. However, the very next day, when Israel had a chance to make its reply, their submission was live streamed on every Western media outlet. The recent investigations that Mr. Ram mentioned in The Intercept, there have been similar ones in the Colloquium and also by Mona Chalabi, into coverage by the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, the BBC, as well as US cable channels like CNN, MSNBC, and Fox about how they're covering this war in Gaza. And like was already mentioned, there is a disproportionate emphasis on Israeli deaths. But also, the very mention of Palestinians sharply declined as the war went on, as the Palestinian death toll got higher and higher. You had IDF spokespeople, that's Israeli Defense Forces spokespeople, being interviewed multiple times on cable channels in the US with little to no pushback. And another study that Mona Chalabi did shows that words identifying victims, words like mother, father, grandfather, son, daughter, grandchild, granddaughter, were used 6 times more frequently in reference to Israelis than to Palestinians. The past 3 months, as we've already talked about, has been the deadliest war on children in modern history. 10,000 Palestinian children have been killed. Every day, more than 10 Palestinian children are losing one or both of their legs. This is a horrifying toll by any measure, surely one worthy of front-page coverage. Yet, in The Intercept's analysis of over 1,100 articles in the major newspapers of the US, the word children only appears in 2 headlines in stories about the conflict. This kind of systematic dehumanization is not accidental. Over and over again, the message is clear. Israeli lives are valuable, Palestinians are expendable. Palestinian lives are simply not worth mourning. Israeli violence is always justifiable. Palestinian violence is barbaric, inhumane, and inexplicable. While Israeli officials have openly called for wiping Gaza off the earth, they've described Palestinians as human animals, repeatedly made calls for genocidal violence, and then proceeded to attack one of the most densely populated tiny strips of land in the world. The media has focused largely, and again, the mainstream media, as Professor Pape pointed out, has largely focused on the brutality of Hamas on October 7th. But history did not begin on October 7th. By the evening of October 6th, Israel had already killed more than 200 Palestinians in 2023. I want you to imagine for a moment that you are a college-age Palestinian in Gaza on the evening of October 6th. You have already lived through and survived 3 devastating wars: 2008, 2009, 2012, and 2014. Which means an amount of trauma that most of us are lucky enough not to fully comprehend, being terrified of dying at any moment, trying to save loved ones, losing your friends and relatives, possibly even watching them die. You've lived through 17 years of the brutal siege of Gaza. At the best of times, your access to food, water, fuel, electricity, medical supplies, all kinds of essential goods necessary to live a decent life was limited, but you've also experienced times when it's simply run out. Some of your loved ones died because of lack of access to these services. Several of your family members and friends' homes have been demolished. A majority of the men you know have been imprisoned and have stories of being tortured in prison. Your grandparents are refugees from 1948 and still speak of the homes and lands they were expelled from. In 2018, when you were in high school, you and your friends joined the largest non-violent protest in Palestine, a peaceful march to the border. You were met with violence by Israeli soldiers. Someone you know lost his eyes. Several others were seriously injured. A few were even killed. Even if you've never gone to a protest, you put your head down and you just wanted to study, you still had to miss classes for weeks. And if by chance you were lucky enough to get a scholarship to leave Gaza and study elsewhere, you still haven't gotten that rare and coveted permission from the Israelis to leave. You're stuck. Just like over 2 million others crammed into a 140 square mile strip of land in one of the most densely populated areas of the world. Stuck at the mercy of the Israeli government to live a free and decent life, a government you have no interaction with except when you're bombed from the skies or invaded by Israeli soldiers. Saying all of this is not excusing the Hamas-led attack of October 7th that killed 1,200 Israelis. It's simply to say that it actually is the media's responsibility to provide context, to make sense of violence that seems inexplicable. Yet, most of the mainstream media doesn't think it's worth mentioning that putting 2 million people in a cage, limiting access to their food, water, electricity, and medical supplies for 17 years, preventing them from leaving Gaza, and the ongoing torture, imprisonment, segregation, dispossession, occupation, and apartheid policies that Palestinians have endured for 75 years might one day produce horrific violence in return. Colonialism isn't a relic of the past for Palestinians. If we think of Israel as a settler colonials project, then the possibility that decades of colonial violence and repression might produce a violent reaction should not surprise anyone. But judging from the reactions of Western media, it does. Over and over again, we see this in Western media coverage of Israel and Palestine. History doesn't exist. It only begins on the day a Palestinian attacks an Israeli. I wanted to go to Gaza when this war began, but there was no way for foreign journalists to enter Gaza. It's only after the ground invasion that the IDF began to allow a few Western journalists with major agencies to come in as embedded reporters. As the death toll grew each day, I had a hard time keeping track of the individual stories of loss and remembered the stories of people I had met in Gaza in March of 2009, 2 months after what Israel called Operation Cast Lead, a 22-day assault from December 2008 to January 2009. 1,400 Palestinians and 13 Israelis were killed in that assault. I went in via Egypt that time, embedding with a peace caravan, and then broke away from the group to do my own reporting. I'm going to just share some of those stories from an article I wrote about that trip. One family of 10 in Jabalia in northern Gaza hid under the staircase of their destroyed home for 12 days, with no food and little water, while US-made F-16 fighter planes and Apache helicopters dropped bombs all around them. Each day felt like an entire year, 42-year-old Jihad said. His mother, Mahdiya, can vividly recall how, as a terrified young bride in 1948, she was driven by Jewish militias from her birthplace of Simsim, now a nature reserve in Israel. She's lived through decades of Israeli occupation in Jabalia refugee camp, the largest and most crowded camp in Gaza and the birthplace of the First Intifada in 1987. But she said she'd never experienced such savagery as this recent assault. Every day we died anew, Mahdiya said, but at least we only lost our homes and not our children. For others, such as Dr. Izzuddin Abul Aish, a well-known doctor and peace advocate who lives in the same neighborhood, Israel's war resulted in a wrenching loss. A day and a half before the official end of the war, Israeli tanks fired deliberately on his home, killing 3 of his daughters and his niece in an instant. On the same day, Mohammed Shurrab from Khan Yunis refugee camp in the south was driving home from his orchards when Israeli soldiers fired at his car. As his son stepped out of the car, the soldiers shot 28-year-old Qassab in the chest and 18-year-old Ibrahim below his knee. Qassab died instantly, and Israeli soldiers warned over a loudspeaker to the injured father that if he made a single phone call, he would risk losing his second son as well. Over the next 12 hours, Shurrab could only watch as his second son bled to death. When the ambulances were finally permitted to come at midnight, he said, it took 1 minute to reach the hospital. I went to the emergency room, and my 2 young men went to the morgue. In the farming village of Khoza, several members of the An-Najjar family crowded into a single room late on January 12th as bulldozers demolished their homes, farms, livestock, and white phosphorus rained down from above. The next morning, a group of 20 women came outside the house waving white flags. Ruhiya, a mother of 3, was shot in the head while waving a white flag by an Israeli sniper and left to die on the street. She bled for over 12 hours before her family was allowed to approach her body. The Samuni family in Zaytun, just east of Gaza City, lost 29 members in early January of 2009. On January 5th, tank shells struck a home sheltering dozens. After 4 days, rescue workers found a few deeply traumatized and wounded survivors trapped in a pile of rubble and corpses. Staring out at the ruins of his home, Abu Adnan is haunted by what happened. I came face to face with death. How can I ever forget seeing the bloodied and dismembered bodies of my own family? His cousin Hamid Samuni added, this used to be lush farmland. Now it's a land of ghosts. 15 years ago, the destruction I witnessed seemed unbearable. The sheer trauma of everyone I met seemed insurmountable. How would people ever recover from such horror? When I came back to New York after a week of doing nonstop interviews in Gaza, I could barely speak to anyone. The stories I heard were circling in my head. How can we continue living our lives normally when this has happened? I kept thinking. Of course, it's only gotten worse since then, with every successive Israeli war on Gaza in 2012, then 2014, and even in 2018, when Palestinians organized their Great March of Return. A non-violent civil rights march to the border was met with so much violence that 31,000 Palestinians were injured. In this current war, the death toll is simply unimaginable. Over 23,000, and almost certainly an undercount when you think of people trapped in the rubble. The scenes in Gaza we're watching in real time over social media are straight out of a horror movie. Hospitals and schools bombed, body parts everywhere, amputations without anesthesia, starvation and being on the brink of famine, using vinegar to clean wounds, child after child being pulled out of the rubble, bits of children covered in ash, morgues so full that bodies are stored in ice cream trucks. 90% of the people in Gaza have been displaced. They've been forced to leave their homes, grab their most important belongings, and walk miles and miles to the south, where Israel promised they would be safe. And then they were bombed while they were walking, and then bombed again in so-called safe zones. We know all this because of Palestinian journalists on the ground, not the mainstream media. Israel initially banned independent foreign reporters from entering Gaza, and then allowed a few journalists to embed with them. So most of what we're seeing is from Palestinian journalists, as well as ordinary young people sharing what they are witnessing on social media. Perhaps like many of you, I've been glued to Instagram since October 7th, watching the flood of live videos, and people like Mu'taz Azaiza, Bisan, Plestia Lakad, Hind Khodairi, Wissam Nasir, Ahmed Hijazi. These names are now accounts I check every single morning, making sure they're still alive. Are they okay? What horrors are they witnessing today? What is the world going to do about it? One of the best-known Palestinian journalists in the Arab world is Al Jazeera's Gaza bureau chief, Wael Dahdouh. He was on air in October when he was told his wife and daughter and son were killed in an airstrike. A few weeks later, an airstrike targeted him and his cameraman. Israeli forces blocked ambulances from reaching the cameraman Samir Abu Daqqa for 5 hours, so he simply bled to death. And a few weeks later, in early December, Wael's son, Hamza, also a young journalist, was killed in an airstrike. Gaza is the most dangerous place in the world to be a journalist. Nowhere is safe. 1 out of every 10 journalists has been killed. And with every journalist killed, the war becomes harder to understand. Yet their efforts have not been in vain. Something we're seeing most movingly in the number of social media videos by Palestinian journalists that were used in South Africa's submission to the ICJ last week. I want to end by reminding us that despite the horrific genocidal violence we're rightfully focused on, the Palestinian struggle is not just about Gaza. And it's certainly not about Hamas, nor simply about outright wars and killing. As we saw during the Unity Intifada of 2021, young Palestinians refused to be fragmented as Gazans, West Bankers, Jerusalemites, and so-called Arab Israelis. They call themselves Palestinian citizens of Israel. They see themselves as Palestinians divided across different legal regimes by a colonial regime of Israel. The media has a long way to go when it comes to covering these struggles in a connected way. Palestinians call the ethnic cleansing that forced them from their land in 1948 the Nakba, which means catastrophe. But going to the West Bank last summer, I had an unforgettable taste of what Palestinians mean when they use the term ongoing Nakba, which is how they describe the last 75 years of their experience of being on the receiving end of apartheid policies and the constant justification and erasure of ethnic cleansing. What this means is that even when they are not at war, Israeli policies are geared towards making life in historic Palestine unlivable for Palestinians. This is not only done through the aggression of its military and settler society, but also a carefully constructed regime of legal, civil, and administrative restrictions, all of which are designed to humiliate and terrorize Palestinians. The West Bank may not be under a siege like Gaza, but it still feels like a technologically enabled, industrial-scale internment camp. Being in the West Bank gave me a very visceral sense of how much the occupation grinds one down, even in times when no one is being directly killed, of how profoundly overwhelming and infuriating and terrifying it is to feel constantly surveilled, to have constant, unpredictable limits on your freedom of movement in the form of 76 checkpoints and 600 movement restrictions, which, by the way, allow any Palestinian town to be sealed in just 5 minutes, to be stopped at any time by armed soldiers, to live amongst 400,000 armed Jewish settlers whose roads you are not allowed to use, but who can attack your homes and take over your neighborhoods, to have the army build a wall in the middle of your neighborhood and separate you from your friends and family, to have settlers attack your schools and throw garbage all over your properties when you don't let them take it over, and to never get a permit to build a home on your land, and to risk having anything you build be demolished, to risk indefinite detention and being held without charge if Israel decides that you may in the future pose a security threat to them. All simply for being Palestinian, and almost always not being able to hold anyone accountable for any of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Anjali. We have about 15 minutes, therefore we'll take about 4 to 5 questions. Open to the... Just questions. Yeah, just questions, no observations, please. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone. As you said, there is no sense and real news being broadcasted to people from almost all media channels and newspapers except a very few. Is this because of fear that is instigated by governments using some draconian laws like here in India, like UAPA, where a lot of journalists have been jailed with false accusations, or maybe they have been sold out their sincerity in bringing out the original news. Maybe they have become the mouthpieces of government. So are these two things that we have to think about? And why journalists like Arnab Goswami and Piers Morgan are being celebrated for biased news, and the likes of Rana Ayub and Gauri Lankesh are shown as traitors? Is this the same scenario worldwide media industry as you all mentioned? Even in US and Europe, where the freedom of speech and expression is considered as holy. Can we see that this democracy has failed, where its basic principles like freedom of speech and expression are being crushed by democratically elected governments? Thank you.
2 more questions, then we'll answer together.
See, it was explained about the Western media's bias in reporting. And recently, the BBC, there was a person, Samir Shah. He is being taken over as the chief of the BBC group now. And in fact, a few months back or a year back, his documentary on Gujarat program was banned, and I understand it was banned, and it was not, it was prevented from publication here in India. What about, is there any change you see in the attitude of BBC since Samir Shah has taken over? I understand he's an Indian origin from Aurangabad.
2 more questions. Yeah. We'll just take a question from the students before. Yeah, please.
Okay. Good evening. I am Nitika Jha, a student at Asian College. Thank you for this eloquent exposition. My question is for Sashi sir. Sir, you talked about narrative creation. Please tell us, how do we as journalists identify the narrative builder and who is benefiting it from? And you also said that it is difficult because the system itself is very complex. If at all we are able to identify, what should be the next step? Thank you.
Yeah, 1 more question and then we'll answer all the questions together. Among students? Okay, if there's no question, we'll answer this. Yes. Yeah, briefly. Yeah, here.
We have Tariq Ali at 5:05, so.
Yes, thank you. Now, Anjali, in terms of the present difficult situation, what is the role of initiatives like Reporter Without Borders and these Doctors Without Borders and similar kind of initiatives? These are known initiatives, but from USA, from European countries, and how this also builds on earlier kind of solidarity. you referred to your visit to Gaza, but also Rachel Corrie, you know about that, and she really gave herself to the wheels of the bulldozer. And so some reflections on that.
Thanks.
I'll quickly answer, what was addressed to me. Yeah, the thing is, the mainstream media as a category. Now, there are entry points and exit points. Al Jazeera is good on Gaza. Al Jazeera is bad on Russia, Ukraine. So, don't for a moment think of it as everlastingly good. If you were to try and get Al Jazeera's view on how Gulf sheikdoms, particularly Qatar, is, you can't rely on it because there's no freedom of speech in the Qatar, which runs, which finances Al Jazeera. So this is not an endorsement of the one or the other. The mainstream media is under the, and the whole structural problem is what I was explaining, that the big news agencies, as disclosed in the Swiss policy research paper in 2016 and 19. And therefore, how do you pierce this? I think here you have examples. You know what's happening in Gaza, nevertheless, because as Anjali mentioned, there are people there, people who are affected, who are sending these videos. There was a wonderful, in the international court in Hague, when I was listening to the presentation made by South Africa, and after that Al Jazeera had this discussion, and they were asking someone in Gaza, what do you think, the Gazan reporter, what do you think the people in Gaza are making of this? What's happening in International Court of Justice on their behalf? And that person said, the people in Gaza have no time to make anything out of it because they're busy dying. So, but that is, I think, the real news. Yeah, sorry. Did you want to talk about, what is other, Anjali can probably address I think you had a question about Reporters Sans Frontiers, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are some solidarity movements, but I think like Mr. Sasikumar said, there's an amazing movement of young people now in the US that's become quite sympathetic to the Palestinians. And they're not just Arab or Muslim. Many of them are Jewish. There's a wonderful group called Jewish Voices for Peace that is doing tremendous work in solidarity with Palestinians. You mentioned Rachel Corrie. Rachel was a member of the International Solidarity Movement, which doesn't exist anymore. But a lot of the members, some of the ex-members of that group have gone on to sort of be involved in different types of solidarity movements. But something has really changed in the past. Since 2014, there's been a marked shift in the US, at least, among young people of all races who find it just shocking. And I think especially with the Black Lives Matter movement and the critique of police violence and a lot of white people coming out and saying, okay, this is wrong, they see the similarities and they can't be quiet anymore. So that's a very good thing. I think in terms of established organizations like Reporters Without Borders, I think they're trying, but what's interesting about this moment is that institutions aren't being allowed into Gaza. So especially these past 3 months, there's been so much difficulty even getting aid in, like basic aid in. So all the information is coming out from Palestinians in Gaza, and then people who are relating to them on social media, which is largely just young people, are organizing using that. So that's what's, I think, different and interesting about this moment.
So we would like to have your...
On what these media protecting organizations can do, I think they can document it. The Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, based in New York, is doing an excellent job on tracking deaths of journalists. Everyone, they verify, and it has to be in connection with the journalist's job, he or she, and they find out what the motive of the killing was. In this case, there's one category there called caught in crossfire or covering conflict. But I don't think it will fit into that. This is deliberate killing civilians, including journalists. Deliberate killing. Who are these journalists killed? Largely those who are already there. Otherwise, how could they have got in to Gaza? They can't go through formal channels and so on, unless you go with the IDF as embedded journalists. So they've done a good job. I haven't seen the latest figures on this, but look at the data on India, journalists killed, and also they compiled something called the Global Impunity Index. I won't go into the details. So they are doing a very good job, and Reporters Without Borders also calls attention to it. But can they get in and actively intervene in the situation? No. If I were an editor of a media organization today, say in India, I don't think I would be able to send anyone to Gaza. First of all, you have no way of getting in and exercising your role playing your role as a journalist. Secondly, who's to answer for his or her life without any kind of protection? Of course, they may be willing to take a risk, but here it will be cold-blooded murder that where you are complicit in asking a journalist to go there and covering it, unless you can point to ways and means where maybe a reasonable risk is taken, but not the kind of overwhelming odds against which these journalists go. And I think if you have journalists already there, they're able to function underground or in a very secretive way and put out the news, that's a different matter. I don't know if the Malayalam press, which is well represented in the West Asian countries, at least some of them, Malayalam Manorama, Mathrubhumi, even Deshabhimani and so on, whether they have access to such sources. If they do, then that should be good. On the other question of why they do it, I don't think you can attribute to these mainstream media any honorable motives of like being afraid of UAPA and so on. I don't think that's what holds them back. They are buying into this narrative. They are largely suborned on matters like this, not on everything. And of course, there are spaces where people express views and editorial opinions which are different. But they have no access to the way Anjali described her experiences. They have not been on the spot, very few of them. Almost nobody has been there, to my knowledge, in the recent days. And that India Today video, just find out how they got it, which was used by the Israel officially for the International Court of Justice, about which they boasted in this news item. So I think the motives are complex, but they're ceasing to be independent. They are influenced by the environment, the political environment. The bucks who put pressure on them, many of them buy into it willingly, and so on. Those two TV channels you mentioned, normally in the ACJ we don't name particular media organizations because many of them come and recruit here, and we don't want to play. So we are being careful. We speak out, Sashi Kumar and I, openly as individuals or journalists outside the ACJ, but here I won't name them, but you know who they are.